So for this free response, we're going to be looking at the crossword, or building the crossword puzzle. And we start out with some rules. Crossword puzzle grid is a two-dimensional rectangular array of black and white squares. Some of the white squares are labeled with a positive number according to the crossword labeling rule, which is given here. The crossword labeling rule identifies squares to be labeled with a positive number as follows. So there are actually three types of squares here. There are squares that are black. There are squares that are white and have a number, and then there are squares that are white and don't have a number. And these rules tell you which ones they should be. So a square is labeled with a positive number if and only if the square is white. So black ones don't have a positive number. We're going to be putting in 0 to those squares. And then the square, so if you have a black square, it doesn't get a number. So we're labeling the number right here. If the square does not have a white square immediately above it, so if there's no white square above it, for this one there's no white square above it, for this one there's no white square above it, for this one there's no white square above it, or it does not have a white square immediately to the left, or both. So like this one gets labeled because it doesn't have a white square here. Same with that one. Same with this one because it doesn't have a white square there. This one actually has both. This one only has one of those cases happening because it doesn't have a white square above it. This one only has one of those cases happening because it doesn't have a white square to the left. The squares identified by these criteria are labeled with a consecutive number in row major order. That means they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like you go like this. That's what row major is. You go through the rows and then bump it down. Go through the whole row, bump it down. Go through the whole row and bump it down. So that you can look back on often, but then we are given two classes. One class constructs a square, which we will eventually use. That's in part B. We don't have to use it in part A. And then we have a crossword class, and we're going to be creating a method in here. And we have to notice that, everything that's highlighted in gray means eventually we're going to have to use it at some point. So it says, this question uses two classes, a square class that represents an individual square in the puzzle, and a crossword class that represents a crossword puzzle grid. A partial declaration of the square class is shown below. Here's what I'm thinking. What does it need? What do you need to build a square? And here we can look at the constructor to figure this out. The square constructor consists of whether it's black or not, is black, and then a number. Remember, white squares that fit a certain condition have numbers that are positive and consecutive. White squares that don't fit those conditions, we can say they just have 0. And then maybe the black ones, they have 0 as well. So you get squares have a number and a Boolean telling whether they're black or not. So that's the square class. And then a partial declaration of crossword is shown below. You will implement one method and the constructor in crossword class. So we're going to implement one method and its constructor. So the basic thing that I have that I want to look at here, that I wanted to wrap my mind around, is the fact that I am going to be constructing a crossword just using a 2D array that tells me whether I have a black square or not. So that's the overall idea. That's how I construct my crossword, because here's the constructor. But that says for part B. So maybe part A, private Boolean to be labeled, I need a row, a column, and this black squares Boolean. So like the first thing I'm looking at is for part A. I haven't even read part A, but I use this thing. These are rows and columns. That's easy to figure out. But I use this. It's a 2D array full of Booleans that is called black squares. So I'm going to look for black squares. What the heck is that? So I go back to the top, and I'm looking for black squares. Where does it describe black squares? The crossword puzzle grid has the same dimension as black squares. Okay, there's at least one row in black squares. Okay. So this returns true. Well, actually, black squares is a Boolean 2D array, so it must have true or false in them. So it's like an array of trues or falses. And then here's the line I was looking for. The square at row R and column C is black if and only if squares RC is true. So if in this 2D array there's something that says true, then at those indices, at that R and C value, then that it will have a black square. So that's what that says. Okay, so now I'm ready to go on 5 minutes just reading through this and trying to understand it. And now I'm actually, oh come on. Now I'm actually ready to look at the question. So let's go to part A. Part A, complete the method to be labeled below. So to be labeled needs to return true if a square at row R and column C should be labeled with a positive number, false otherwise. So it kind of gives me like a layout. True if it meets certain conditions, else false. So what are those conditions? Well, I'm saying to be labeled. That follows these rules. So at first it has to be white, and also it doesn't have something like to the left, doesn't have a white square to the left, or doesn't have a white square to the top above it, or both. So I think that's what I want to do. I want to set up something that mimics that part, because that's really the meat of it, just figuring out whether I label it or not. I mean, that's the whole task. The square at row R in column C is black if and only if black squares. Okay, we already read that. And ready to go. And I split this up a little bit differently than the answers do online. I think it's a little bit more understandable, but I'm going to go back and look at my example, and I noticed that the whole top row always gets labeled. If you have a white square, then the top row gets labeled. And if you have a white square, like in that first column gets labeled. So that's one condition that I just should check for. That's the first thing I'm going to check, actually. Actually, now I'm just thinking of it backwards. If you have a black square, then you don't have to label it. So maybe that's what I'll do first. To be labeled, we can tell if we have a black square if this is true. So let's do that part. Let's do the false part first. Just because to me that's like an easy case, the easiest case first. So remember, this is a method inside my Crossword class. It's going right here. So I'm also allowed to use this. I mean, I don't think I'm using it in this one, but I'm passing it some kind of, so like this would be in the driver, I'm passing it some kind of Boolean 2D Boolean array called black squares. So if black squares equals true, and now I could have just not wrote that part, I could have just not have written that part, because black squares is going to return a Boolean. So if black squares returns true, then I would say if and then true. Hopefully that makes sense. If that doesn't make sense, then you can just pay attention to this. So if black squares at R, C, the rows in column C, that's passed to this method. If that's true, well, that means I have a black square. So I do not want to label it. It says return false if you don't want to label it. So I'm just going to say return false. So that's the first. I've just took care of all the black squares. Now from here on out, I know I have white squares. So I'm going to do an else if. So else if the square that I'm looking at should be labeled. And that's why I'm going to return true for this. But what is my condition? Well, I said before, I think the next easiest condition is that either I have the top row or the leftmost row. And that should be easy to figure out. So if I have either of those, it definitely gets a label. So I could say else if R equals 0 or C equals 0. So if that's the case, then that means I'm looking at the top row or the leftmost row. So if that's true, then I definitely want a label, return true, because we're supposed to return true if the square at R, C is to be labeled with a positive integer. So I'm going to say return true. So if I've passed both of these without executing this part or that part, that means I'm not looking at anything here or anything there. So I've taken care of all the black, and I've taken care of all of the top row and the leftmost side. So that means I'm either looking at this or I'm looking at that. Now, how do I figure that out? Well, which one do I want to do first? Maybe I'll say the blank spaces. Let's look at the blank spaces first. So I would be returning false. So another else if. Now I'm looking at the square at R, comma C. That's the rows R and column C. And I need to make sure, so if there's a white square on the left side, or there's a white square above it, then I need to return false. So that's what I'm going to do. If the square to the left of it, and I'm going to look at black squares. So if black squares to the left, and if I'm looking to the left, that means I'm looking at R, and then column -1. That looks at one column back, right? If I'm talking about the columns, I'm on this column, that row, and I want to look one column back, same row, then I'm looking at that one. So that's to the left. So if this is, and I want to make sure if it's white, then I don't label anything. So if the actual square, the square to the left, that's what this says, if that's white, then this will return, or this is going to be false, because black squares returns false if you have a white square. So if this is equals false, I suppose I could say not black squares, but I think this is a little bit more understandable if you're just reading through this the first time. If you already get it, then hopefully you can understand what I'm saying. This part says that the square to the left is white. So maybe like write that down in your notes. This means the square one column back, which is the square to the left, it means that this is going to be a white square, because if it was a black square, this would say true. So if the left square is white, or actually, I don't know if we want an or, right? Because there's a chance that the left square is white, but you still get a label. So maybe it needs to be and. Because here, if I looked at that, this square, the left one is white, but the one on top of it is black. So I can say if we have, maybe it's better to look at, to see if we have black squares. What is my condition up here? I'm going to go back to this. Maybe this is confusing to some people, but it says if a square is labeled if the square is white and the square does not have a white square immediately above it, or does not have a white square immediately to the left, or both. No, I think we'll keep it like this. So if a black square, if you have a white square on the left side of it, and you have has to be and here, and you have a white square above it, then we get no label, right? So here has a white and a white, so it gets no label. That's the only way it gets no label. Here it's white and white, so it gets no label. Here is white and white, it gets no label. Notice I'm saying and. Here, this is black, then it has white, so that one gets a label. Here, this one's black and that one's white, so it gets a label. If I have this, I have white here and here, then it does not get a label. So it needs to be an and. So if that, the square to the left is white and the square above it equals false, then I know that this does not get a label, so I can say return false. So that takes care of a couple of things, but let's just see. This part, that looks and makes sure that in the row above, -1, the row above in that box, you also have a white square, because if it was a black square, this would say true. And inside this 2D array would be a true value. So and return false, that means we don't label it. So what have I checked so far? I've taken care of the black spaces, right? If the space is black, return false. So all the black spaces done. If I have row or columns, or sorry, the first row or the first column, definitely return true because it's not going to be black because I already took care of that. So if it's not black and this is true, then give it a label. Else, if it's not black, which means it's white, and it's not a row or column, which means it's somewhere on, in this area, and it's, it's white, check the columns to the left and to the above it. This condition right here, must come after this condition, or like be checked at the same time. Because if you do this before this part, then you might accidentally have a bounds error because you're checking like to the left of this column. That would be a negative index. So you can't do that. This has to be after this. So what have we checked? We've checked for blacks, done. We've checked for the whites in the, that sounds racist. Checked for the white boxes in the top row and in the left row, and then, left column. And then we've checked on the left or right of it, so blank white ones. Now, the only thing that's left, because we checked this, we've checked that, we've checked all the blank white ones, all that's left are the ones that have to be numbered. So then we can just say, yeah, because there is no other type. The ones that have to be numbered are the only thing that's left. All right? And like if you're uncertain and you had time, you can go through and just pick random boxes and then run through all of these, see if it works out. And it should. I think that's the end. So then we got that. If you want to know the points, you can look it up online. You can just search the College Board or like AP Central or something like that. But there you go. It's just checking. I mean, the solutions online are way, way, way more concise. But I feel like this explains a little bit more if you read it like in English. So there we go. We're checking for those 4 different types, and I'm gonna end this video because it's way, way, way long. So that's part A.